Hey folks, welcome back to the Jet Fuel Only channel. In this video, I'm going to be doing a brake upgrade to the front brakes of my Cadillac CTS VSport. If you haven't seen it already, I've got another video where I cover the rears, but in this one, we're doing the fronts, so stick with me. Alright, so on my Cadillac CTS VSport, I went to the track. I wasn't really happy with the braking performance, so I wanted to upgrade the brakes. Today we're going to put in new Hawk pads and new StopTech rotors on the front. Now, this video is also useful for you if you're just changing your brake pads or changing your brake pads and rotors. Whether you upgrade or not, it's the same procedure. The front brakes on the CTS VSport are 4-piston Brembo style brakes, and Brembo style brakes are a little different than how we do the rear brakes on this car, but once you learn how to do the Brembo style, you can almost do any Brembo style. They're very similar. Now, I'd love to tell you how to choose the right brake pad and rotor, also when to change the brake pads and why, but if you've already watched the rear brake video, you have already seen that discussion, so feel free to skip ahead to this time to get to the procedure. Now, how do you know it's time to change your brakes? Well, obviously, if it starts squealing, there's a little metal squealer that's designed to start touching the rotor and squealing when you step on the brakes, and this is to warn you that it's time to change your brake pads. You can also look and see how much pad material you have. Also, the rotors might give you a heads up that they're going bad. Maybe they're warped and you get pulsating in the brake pedal. Or maybe you've got hot spots or cracks on the rotor or grooves. These are all things that you might want to look at and consider changing these parts out. Now, you can also just change your brakes because you want to upgrade. So a common upgrade is to get maybe pads that are better for your style of driving and maybe some rotors that are better for your style of driving or the look that you want with your car. A lot of people like to do the slotted and drilled rotors because they look more sporty on your car, or maybe people want better pads like the ceramic metallic or ceramic carbon pads, whatever is out there, because those are less noisy and less dusty. Other people, like myself, want something a little more aggressive that can handle the beating at the track occasionally and all the autocrossing I do. So today, for my brake upgrade, I'm installing the Hawk HP Plus pads and StopTech rotors. Now, what about when you're choosing a rotor? Well, it just depends on why you're upgrading your rotor. If you just drive street or aggressive street, the OEM rotors are fine. But if you want something that looks more aggressive and sporty, you might want something that has slots or cross drilling. A lot of people like to choose the Power Stop rotors. They look pretty good. I think they've got some plating that keeps them looking nice, and people are pretty happy with those. But if you are going to do more tracking, actually cross drill rotors seem to be the lesser choice because the holes are a great place for cracks to start under the extreme temperatures of driving at the track. That temperature you may never reach on the street, so it might not matter that you've got cross drilled holes there. But on the track, slotted rotors are good. They help let gases out from between the pad and the rotors, or also any of the excess material that starts burning off from the pads. So that's why I've chosen slotted rotors, but a lot of people also just go for smooth rotors. Now, when it comes to brake pads, there's this whole spectrum of brake pads out there. Over here, you've got street pads, and some of the better street pads that people like are the ceramic ones, or ceramic metallic, ceramic carbon, whatever. They tend to be a little more than the just semi-metallic pads, but they are quieter, they have a lot less dust, and that's really important, right, when you want to keep your wheels shiny. And Power Stop, for example, makes the Z23 pads, which are supposed to be fairly aggressive, but still like don't dust much and stuff, and everyone's been fairly happy with those, I think. Now, as you go to the other side of the spectrum, you have track pads. And track pads are great for the track, but they're bad on the street because they don't bite really well when the car's cold, and they're really noisy and really dusty, and I know you don't want to put up with any of that. But over here, if you do street pads, they bite really well on cold temperatures in the morning or once you're warmed up and hot breaks in traffic. So they kind of do everything you need it to on the street, realistically. Today, I've chosen to install Hawk HP Plus pads, which are kind of in the middle. They are Hawk's most aggressive pad before you go into the full-on track pads. So unfortunately, they're still dusty. They do squeal a bit, but they have enough cold bite to not be unsafe in the cold, and they can handle some higher temperatures of track and heavy autocross use. That's what they say, and I still haven't tried it out the track yet, but I'll let you know when that happens. Now, your other option is have street pads and have track pads, but remember that pad compounds aren't always compatible, and you're always leaving a compound on the rotor, and so you don't want to kind of cross those compounds, and it's often recommended that when you switch to track pads that you sand down your rotor to get the old like ceramic compound off. The other thing is when we do this install, you'll also want to bed your brakes, which means this is kind of where you marry the pads compound to the rotor and put a thin layer of the pads compound on the rotor so it's maximum friction. Now, generally your OEM brakes are gonna be pretty expensive, and like I said, a lot of people are happy with Power Stop's E23 kits. You get brakes, rotors, and everything for the Cadillac CTS, and it tends to be cheaper than OEM, and it looks better, and probably is a little less dusty. So be sure to check that out if you're just looking for some good street driving. Otherwise, you might check out Hawk pads, or if you really wanna get into track stuff, Carbotech, G-Lock, they all make great track pads from what I hear. Now, one last thing, if you are just changing your pads, that's okay, but I honestly prefer to always change my rotors as well. It's totally not required, but again, we're thinking about pad compound compatibility. You can always take your rotors to a shop, or some auto parts store will turn the rotors, where they basically machine off the top layer of the rotors so you can have a nice fresh start. And you can do that once or twice on a rotor, but eventually it becomes too thin and you just need to replace the rotors anyway. Either way, rotors aren't always expensive unless you've got a really high performance car, so I don't really mind putting on new rotors every time. But it's totally up to you. Swapping out just the pads is acceptable as well, as long as your rotor is in good condition. All right, I think I've talked enough about when, why, and how. Let's get to that front brake procedure right now. All right, here's your quick overview of the install. We have the caliper, the rotor, the pad retaining pins, and the spring clip. We'll use a hammer and a punch to push out the retaining pins so we can remove the spring clip. Next, we'll remove the two large bolts on the back of the caliper to get the caliper off. Then, we'll have the pads free. Then, we'll remove the rotor by removing the retaining screw, sliding off the old rotor, and putting the new one on. Next, we'll prepare our new pads for installation by greasing them up, putting them in the caliper, and installing the caliper again. After torquing down the caliper bolts, we'll finish off by replacing the spring clip and the two retaining pins. Now that's the basics, but there are some important details, so let's get to those. For this installation, you'll need the following tools. A breaker bar will be handy because there's a couple of bolts that are on there pretty tight. You also need a torque wrench to put them back on properly. A small hammer is needed to knock out the pins in the caliper. You might need a screwdriver like this, but most likely you might need a big flathead to push the caliper pistons back. Now you can use a couple of ratchet wrenches, especially the big one. The big one might do the job if the breaker bar isn't available. On the VSport, you need a 21mm socket and a T27 Torx. The Torx removes the rotor. You'll also need some Loctite. I thought I had the red Loctite. It's a red bottle, but this is blue Loctite. They suggest red, but blue will work too. And some good brake and caliper grease. I try to stay away from the stuff you find at the cash register at the auto parts store. One time I got some and it was like really sticky stuff. I didn't like it, so I like to have a good tube of it at home. With Brembo brakes, you need to tap out the pins, and so you'll need a punch. This punch doesn't really work though, it's a little too wide, so I ended up just cutting a piece of hanger and making a punch, or you can use a small Allen key. Otherwise, you should use a punch similar to what's in this set, and you can find a link to it in the description below. I also made a couple of hooks like this, and this is to hang the caliper from the spring in the wheel well while you work on the brakes. You can also buy a similar thing from the auto parts store, but I just made one from a metal hanger. Also, get some gloves, especially rubber gloves. You need to protect your hands, especially when using this brake cleaner. You'll want a couple of cans of those handy to clean up your brakes. Also some all-purpose cleaner and various brushes to help clean things up. You will of course need a jack and jack stands to get your car off the ground, and if you need help with how to raise your vehicle or removing your wheels, I have videos available for that too, so be sure to check them out. Alright, here's our front brake rotor and caliper. Notice we have a spring clip and two pad retaining pins. We need to remove those. So grab your punch and gently tap the pin out. Notice again, I'm using that punch that gets a little too wide, so it gets stuck and doesn't quite get the pin out. So then I use this thick piece of hanger, or you can use an Allen key. Push it out and then grab it from the back and pull it out. Now take care of the second pin and the spring clip will come completely out. All right, now there's something I need to tell you. You see on the Camaro and Corvette calipers, it's a square opening on the outside of the caliper, but the V-Sport has this weird hexagonal opening, at least on the 2015s and later. It's because of this hexagon opening, you can't just pull the pads right out of there. But with a Camaro caliper, you can pull the pads right out of that rectangular opening, and it makes things really easy to swap out pads. But unfortunately, on some V-Sports, you have to just take the caliper off to get to the pads like we're doing today. All right, next we'll need to open our brake reservoir cap to allow fluid to move more easily when we push the pistons back. Take note of your brake fluid level though. If you think it's gonna rise up and overflow, you might wanna take some out. This is an important step because with Camaro calipers, you're gonna wanna press the pistons back into the caliper before removing your pads, otherwise the pads might not come out. Let's look at the back of the caliper. There are these silver hexagonal bolts, but those just hold the caliper together, so don't touch those. Then there's the brake line in the center, but what we want to focus on removing are these big 21mm caliper mounting bolts. Without having the car on the lift, it's a bit of a pain to get back there and get at them, especially when they are torqued down pretty hard. I tried hard with a large ratchet, but that wasn't enough, so then I just decided to tap at the ratchet with a hammer. Now, that's not the best technique, honestly, especially because these are non-impact sockets and they do kind of flex, but you gotta do what you gotta do in a tight spot. Now I was able to get the lower bolt with my air impact wrench and that made things pretty easy, but it wouldn't fit to get the top one out. So then I had to try to get out the breaker bar. Unfortunately, the breaker bar is really long and it's hard to work with when the car is low to the ground. But I did make it happen. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite fit unless you remove this mag ride sensor on the V-Sport, but not all cars have this, so this may not get in your way. So I went ahead and moved this out of the way, and then I had enough room to really get at it with the breaker bar. Once you've broken it loose of that breaker bar, just use your large ratchet and finish unscrewing that bolt. It could still be kind of tight. These are in with Loctite, so they're sort of half glued in there. Whoever thought 2 bolts would be such a pain? Now that those are out, the caliper should come out, but be careful, the pads will just fall right out once the caliper comes off. But if you have most Brembo calipers, you would have already been able to pull the pads out through the top. All right, so now you got this big heavy caliper. Don't drop it. You see it's connected to the brake line, and if you let it hang, you could damage the brake line. So that's why we need this hook that we made out of a hanger or one that you bought at the store. You just hook it on the spring of the strut and then the other end on the caliper and let it safely hang there. This is a great way to work on this heavy piece of metal. You can't just hold it all day. Now here's the caliper off the car. You'll want to push all 4 of those pistons, or 6 if you have 6, back into the caliper. This really only works if you have the cap off your brake reservoir like I showed you earlier. Be careful not to damage the rubber seals though. You might be able to do it by hand or just use a C-clamp. Now that the caliper's off, we need to remove the rotor. We're going to use a T27 Torx, at least on the V-Sport, and remove this retaining bolt. Now this may not even be there. Some cars don't have it and it's not totally necessary. The wheel and the caliper hold it in place really. If you have a hard time turning it, stick a screwdriver in the slots of the rotor to make a handle and you'll be able to break the bolt free. Once you get that bolt out, the rotor just slides on off. However, if it's been on there a while and it's rusted, it may be tough and you may need to tap the center section with a hammer to break some of that rust loose, or use some penetrating lubricant to help out. Now it's time to clean up any brake parts that are going to go back on the car, like the caliper. Spray it with brake cleaner and scrub it gently with a soft bristle brush, and spray it again to rinse it away. Be careful, make sure you know which direction the nozzle's spraying, and wear safety goggles. Believe me, I've made this terrible mistake before. If you get any on the rubber seals, be sure to wipe it off right away. It's not good for the rubber. This is also a great time to clean up your suspension parts. Use some all-purpose cleaner and some of that brake cleaner with a brush and you'll get it nice and clean. Here's the dirty before and here's the new after. It's important to clean the hub where the rotor attaches to, otherwise you could have some brake pulsation. All right, now it's time to inspect and prepare the pads for installation. Can you tell which one's the new one? Yeah, there's a lot of extra pad on the new one. This is also a good time to double check and make sure they are the same as the pads that were in your car. Sometimes you get it wrong and you don't want to put the wrong pads in. If they're wrong, put your old pads back in and send back these new ones. All right, let's put the rotor on. This is easy enough. It just slides right on in, and then we replace that retainer bolt. Now replace that retainer bolt, but it doesn't have to go on too tight. Just make it snug. It's not that important. Remember, some cars don't even have one. Next, prep your caliper bolts. Try to clean off the old Loctite and then add some new Loctite. You only need enough to cover about 1/3 of the length of the bolt. Set those bolts aside and keep them handy. Next, we're gonna grease the pads. A lot of brake pads you would grease all the edges and the back sides, but with Brembo style pads you only need to do the outer edges. Next is a tricky part. With the V-Sport, you're gonna have to hold the pads inside the caliper while you get it over the rotor. Other cars with Brembo calipers, you can just put the caliper on and add the pads in after. So I'm gonna put a pad, one on each side. Trying not to get any of that brake grease on the pad itself. That's not a good thing. Once you have the pads in position, you can just hold the caliper with one hand, and then I'm going to use my left hand here to hold the pads apart so I can get them on one on each side of the rotor. A little fiddling with it and you'll get it in place. Now grab one of those bolts that you kept handy and start screwing them in. Get the second one too, and the caliper will stay stable. Get those caliper mounting bolts tight with a ratchet wrench, and then get at them with the torque wrench. It was a tight space to get these bolts off, and it's a tight space to torque them down properly. You want to torque them down to 111 foot-pounds plus 30 degrees. All right, now that you've torqued down the bolts, make sure you put your mag ride cable back into its clipped position if you had one to remove. All right, the last step is to put the pins and spring clip back in. First, position the pads so the holes are lined up with the pin holes on the caliper. Now you can set your spring clip into position. Notice how I'm putting it in. Then run one of the pins from the back side. Make sure you've cleaned the pins, and if you want you can put a little grease on them too, but I didn't. I guess some people have problems with them locking up though. Once you think it's lined up, tap at it gently with the hammer. Try not to damage your nice caliper. I just painted these. And then you can see the pin come out the other side, and now you know it's set. Do the same with the lower one. Use your finger to put the spring into position to get things lined up so that the pin can go through. Be sure to note the proper way to install the spring clip. If you think you might forget, take a picture before taking it apart. All right, now it's all together. Now don't forget to put your brake reservoir cap back on and check the fluid level. Add or subtract fluid as necessary so it's at the max fill line. Now enjoy those beautiful upgraded rotors and pads. All right, that's it. We've changed the brake pads and rotors on the front of my Cadillac CTS VSport, and with those 4-piston Brembo brakes, so the same brakes you're going to see on the Camaro SS, the ATS, the CT6, even the base level Corvettes. So it's a very common brake. Others have 6 pistons. They are a little different. They might have 1 extra pin to remove, but very similar. All right, now that you have new pads and rotors in, please be careful. You need to first start the car, press the brake pedal until your pressures come up, and then you need to take the car for a little drive where you bed in the pads. This is where you marry the pads material with the rotor so that there's a thin layer of that pads material like stuck into the rotor, and then that makes a better friction surface. To do that, follow the manufacturer's bedding procedure. Look it up online if it didn't come with the brakes themselves. Generally though, it's, you know, accelerate to maybe 30, 40, 50 miles an hour maybe, and then come to a near complete stop, like almost to a stop, but maybe 10 miles an hour. Don't stop the brake completely, and then accelerate and do it a few more times. I think that it's generally recommended to do it at least 7 times till you get the brakes really heated up. You'll start to smell that brake burning smell, and that's a good sign. All the while, you really want to try to avoid any situation where you come to a complete stop and you're holding that brake rotor with your brakes. If needed, put the car in park at a stoplight or whatever. Just try to minimize it. Not a big deal if you can't. Be safe about it, but try to do that, come home and let the brakes cool completely and you'll be set. Listen for any weird sounds or whatnot. I actually installed my spring clip in backwards on one of my wheels and I was getting a weird clunk out of it, and I'm glad I found it and figured it out, and my brakes are fine now. These HP Plus pads are a little noisy and definitely dusty, but I do like how they grip under heavy braking, like off of highway speed and such, so we'll see how they do at the track. All right, if you learned something and you think you can change your Brembo brakes, please hit that like button. And of course, I love your subscriptions. Hit the bell to be notified of my next video, which should be brake caliper painting. So if you're looking forward to that, hit the bell. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching the Jet Fuel Only channel. We'll see you next time.